name is James Boss, and I'm Assistant Professor of Religion here at the University of Mississippi. It's my great privilege to welcome you to the 2016 William Furr Dialogue on Religion. The late Professor Furr was a member of our faculty. He taught classes in both philosophy and religion from 1965 till his death in 1974. It's in his honor that we hold this dialogue every 2 years. The funding for this event has been generously provided by the William Furr Foundation, and so I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the members of the Furr family who are in attendance today for their generosity. His wife and surviving Cynthia here, 3 of his daughters, Ginger, Libby, and Susanna, as well as his brother, Ray. So please join me in thanking them for this event. I also very briefly want to acknowledge our co-sponsors for this year's event. So these include the Office of the Provost, the University Lecture Series, the Sally McDonald Barksdale Honors College, the Department of Political Science, the Department of Public Policy Leadership, and the Department of Economics. So I thank each of those units for their support. Professor Furr was an advocate of religious pluralism, as well as an advocate of civil yet rigorous discussion about contemporary religious and ethical topics, both inside the classroom and outside the classroom. And it's in that spirit that we decided upon the topic for this year's dialogue, namely the issue of distributive justice. What does religious and more specifically Christian ethics have to say about things like tax rates, Social Security, food stamps, and income inequality? Considering the proximity to the impending presidential election, these are, of course, critical issues on many persons' minds. And we are fortunate to have 2 very fine scholars with us today who will be addressing these issues, but from 2 rather different perspectives. Each of our speakers will present for approximately 20 to 25 minutes. Their presentations should conclude around 5:50 or 5:55. So we will then have a remaining 20 minutes or so for the dialogue portion of the event, which will be moderated by Dr. Deborah Maurer, seated here in the center. Dr. Maurer is an associate professor of philosophy here at the University of Mississippi, and she'll begin this dialogue portion by asking questions, or 1 or 2 of them, to each of the presenters, and then she'll open the floor to you in the audience, who may also address questions to either or both of our speakers. The dialogue will then conclude around 6:15. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to ask you to mute or silence your cell phones that we don't have any interruptions. Okay, it's my great pleasure then to introduce our 2 speakers to you. Seated on the far end is Dr. Jamin Huebner. Dr. Huebner is an associate professor of Christian Studies, part-time professor of economics, and director of institutional effectiveness at John Witherspoon College in the Black Hills in South Dakota. He's a graduate of Dordt College, where he earned a BA in theology, also a graduate of Reformed Theological Seminary, where he earned an MA in religion, and a graduate of the University of South Africa, from which he earned a PhD in systematic theology. He's currently in the process of earning another degree, an MS in economics from Southern New Hampshire University. He's authored many books and articles and actively serves in several academic societies. He is going to be our second presenter this evening. So near to me then, on this side, is Dr. James Bailey. Dr. Bailey received his master's degree in religion from Yale Divinity School and his PhD in theological ethics from Boston College. His doctoral dissertation was titled Transforming the Liberal Communitarian Debate, Jacques Martin's Vision of Self and Community, and it was written under the direction of David Hollenbach. This dissertation examined the challenge that pluralism poses to our ability to articulate a strong and common basis for the promotion of human flourishing. His book, Rethinking Poverty, Income, Assets, and the Catholic Social Justice Tradition, published by Notre Dame University Press, addresses moral questions related to wealth inequality, as well as innovative public policy proposals aimed at reducing asset poverty. He has presented at both national and international conferences and published in numerous journals, including the Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics, Journal for the Study of Catholic Social Thought and Theological Studies. Dr. Bailey has also been the convener of the Ethics and Political Economy Interest Group at the Society of Christian Ethics since 2004. He also serves as the editor of the Ethics section of Religious Studies Review. He teaches at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he's an associate professor in the theology department. Dr. Bailey is going to be our first presenter tonight, so please join me in welcoming him as he makes his way to the podium.
Good afternoon. First, I want to extend my thanks to the Department of Philosophy and Religion, and especially to the Furr family and the other sponsors, many other sponsors of this event. I won't forget them for their generous support of this event. It's my first time to Oxford, only my second time to Mississippi, actually. So I feel a bit like a tourist who happens to be giving a lecture, and I've been enjoying myself here. And also, I just can't help commenting that here we are in Oxford, Mississippi, and the two main speakers of this event both have significant ties to South Dakota, which strikes me as improbable. What I'm going to do today is focus my remarks on economic inequality, which of course has connections to distributive justice. I'll first have a go at describing briefly the current landscape of economic inequality, with a particular focus on income and wealth inequality. There's other types of economic inequality, but I'm going to focus on those two. For those of you who know anything about Catholic social ethics, this is an exercise in what Catholic social ethicists would call reading the signs of the times. And between income and wealth inequality, I'll spend more time on wealth inequality, in part because I think we don't focus carefully enough on the impact of wealth inequality that it has on people, and no doubt another reason is I've written a book which places doing something about wealth inequality at the center of our public arguments. Among other things, I'll drag you through some arcane public policy practices, both past and present. Hopefully you won't find this too tedious, but if you do, it's not going to last very long. And then I'll turn to a few key principles and concepts in Catholic social teaching that are relevant to economic inequality. This may seem an odd move in a public university in a pluralistic culture, but as the well-known theological ethicist Sarah Moses observes, quoting her, "One of the functions of our traditions of ethical thought is to provide our everyday practical decision-making with a larger moral vision within which to deliberate and act." And so these principles that I'll mention and others may help us to do just that. So let me begin with some words about the current situation and inequality. As I'm sure many of you are aware, there's been a great deal of discussion of inequality in the media. One of the best known recent commentators on inequality is Thomas Piketty, the French economist who managed the seemingly impossible feat of catapulting a nearly 700-page economic tome, Capital in the 21st Century, to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. I can assure you that that's a very unusual occurrence for an economist to have a book at the top of the New York Times bestseller list, especially one as long and as thorough and technical as that book. Piketty argues, among other things, that extreme inequality is more or less a structural feature of capitalism, or at least it is when the rate of return on capital is greater than the rate of economic growth, which turns out to be the rule rather than the exception, according to Piketty. This analysis leads him to recommend significant governmental interventions, including a global wealth tax and much more progressive income taxes, in an effort to reduce excessive concentrations of wealth, thereby attenuating extreme levels of inequality. Not to be outdone, Pope Francis, who himself has managed any number of seemingly impossible feats since becoming Pope, including being named Advocate Magazine's Person of the Year. This is also an amazing feat. Published a tweet that read, and even that is an amazing thing, the Pope published a tweet that read, "Inequality is the root of social evil." A statement echoing a similar claim he made in Evangelii Gaudium, quoting him here, "Inequality is the root of social ills." And he continues in that same document, "We can no longer trust in the unseen forces and the invisible hand of the market. Growth and justice requires more than economic growth, while presupposing such growth. It requires decisions, programs, mechanisms, and processes specifically geared to a better distribution of income, the creation of sources of employment, and an integral promotion of the poor, which goes beyond a simple welfare mentality." In other words, moral markets, and this is me talking, not the Pope. In other words, moral markets are arrived at intentionally, not through some non-human impersonal force like the invisible hand. This is the burden that comes with having moral agency. Being a moral agent comes with moral responsibility, and markets, no less than other human institutions, if they are to be moral, must be shaped deliberately and intentionally. For Pope Francis, as with his predecessors, extreme levels of inequality suggest a number of things: pervasive greed, disordered valuing of material goods over the needs of human beings and creation as a whole, a tendency to privilege the good of a few individuals over the common good, systemic problems in the financial and other sectors of the economy, and of course, a neglect of those living in poverty and a failure to attend to the structural conditions that help keep them in poverty. Of course, not just Piketty and Pope Francis are talking about inequality. Many others have been concerned about growing levels of inequality for quite some time now. And there is a fairly wide consensus that both income and wealth inequality are growing rather than shrinking. If you observe the graph there, in the U.S., the top 10% of income earners now commands over 50% of the nation's income, exceeding income inequality levels just prior to the crash of 1929. As bad as income inequality is, wealth inequality is even worse. The wealthiest 1% of households own over 35% of the wealth in America. The top 10% of U.S. households control 76% of the wealth. And the top 20% owns 90% of all wealth. The bottom 40% of the population owns either no wealth or is actually in debt. So 90% of the wealth is controlled by 20% of the households in this country. The bottom 40% own either no wealth or they're in debt. Wealth inequalities are also significantly different by race, with whites holding roughly $11 to $13 for every dollar held by a brown or black American, respectively. In 2013, the median wealth for white families was approximately $142,000, compared to Hispanics at $13,700 and blacks at about $11,000. So there are significant inequalities in income and wealth, and some of those inequalities, can be, are at least linked to issues of race. And we'll get into why that is, but there are historical reasons for that. We tend to think of savings or assets as a luxury, and in a certain sense they are. If one had to choose between being able to pay for food and being able to pay for college, if you have to make that choice, we'd likely choose paying for food, right? But being asset poor has enormous consequences, enormous human consequences. Let me just mention a few of these. First, having access to wealth allows one to absorb more easily the impact of economic shocks. For example, the loss of a job, the more systemic effects of economic recessions, the sudden onset of illness, the loss of a spouse, and so on. People with access to some savings are in a position to minimize the impact of these unpredictable events. This is not true for the asset poor, 40% of the population, and these events can be catastrophic. Second, there's a considerable literature documenting the fact that people who have some savings and wealth are more likely to plan for the future. The reason for this is sensible enough. If you're just trying to make it day by day, week by week, just to get through, it's hard to think about what the future holds. It's hard to formulate realistic plans. As Michael Shradden has argued, quoting him here, assets financially connect the present with the future. Indeed, in a sense, assets are the future. They are hope in concrete form. If people are to believe in a viable form, there must be some tangible link between now and then. And in very many situations, assets are the link. And there's a considerable amount of literature out there that says if you have assets, you do start to think about the future and plan. And if you don't, mainly because you're just struggling to get by, it's hard to do that. Third, income and wealth provide access to very different kinds of goods. Goods that are both important, but the kinds of good wealth secures appear to have more far-reaching effects. Melvin Oliver and Thomas Shapiro put the point this way: wealth is a special form of money, not used to purchase milk and shoes and other life necessities. More often it is used to create opportunities, secure a desired stature and a standard of living, or pass class status on to one's children. In this sense, the command over resources that wealth entails is more encompassing than is income or education, and closer to the meaning and theoretical significance to our traditional notions of economic well-being and access to life's chances. It's tempting to think, as we all have been told many times, that wealth inequalities are simply the result of the efficient distribution of market economies, rewarding the hardest working or smartest or most innovative persons. Even if we assume that the distributive criteria of merit is the most important one from a causal point of view, and I debate that, it's an open question whether the way in which income and wealth are distributed really merit those kinds of distributions. Is the Wall Street analyst developing and marketing credit default swaps providing greater social utility than, say, an elementary school teacher teaching the next generation of our kids to read and write? I'm not sure that if pay and wealth are linked to certain types of important social activities, that the kindergarten school teacher wouldn't win out. But perhaps the most significant objection to the kind of analysis, to that kind of analysis, that is the analysis that says income and wealth simply are the result of people working harder and being more creative and innovative. The most significant objection to that kind of analysis is that widespread wealth inequalities that we now see are due, at least in part, to differential access to the benefits of public policies that encourage, facilitate, and reward wealth accumulation. Access to the benefits of these policies has been anything but equal, and part of the wealth gap is due to whether or not a person or family had access to these benefits or policies. For example, arguably the most widespread wealth redistribution policy in this country's history was the Homestead Act, which distributed 160 acres of land to millions of Americans at virtually no cost. The size of this land distribution was greater, the overall size of this land distribution was greater than the combined acreage of California and Texas. That's a lot of land. And it was essentially given away. Conservatively, 25% of Americans living today can trace some of their wealth back to the Homestead Act. The problem is not only that much of this land, and this is a big problem, was taken by force from native Indians that were already living here. That's basically stole land from the Indians. That's a big moral problem. But also, and apart from that, it was distributed in ways that were highly discriminatory. White Americans were the primary beneficiaries of this policy, and blacks, by and large, were excluded from participation because they were black. A similar point can be made about other initiatives that have helped white Americans accumulate wealth. The GI Bill, which paid for GI's education and also gave them a monthly stipend. Access to that bill was restricted oftentimes by race. Restricted covenants that prevented blacks from owning valuable property. Redlining as an official policy that denied home ownership to black Americans except upon the most unfavorable terms. All of these things have conspired to help generate wealth inequalities by race that we now see. The second kind of policy approach to wealth accumulation should also give us pause when thinking about economic inequality as being the natural result of merit-based distributions. In recent decades, decades that have seen income and wealth inequalities grow dramatically, public policies have provided greater incentives and material rewards for wealth accumulation for some Americans and not others. These incentives and rewards have been targeted mostly at the wealthiest of Americans. Indeed, current asset-based strategies are so focused on the non-poor, it would not be inaccurate to characterize them as a preferential option for the non-poor, which is a play on the preferential option for the poor within Catholic social teaching. To illustrate this, and this is where it gets a little technical on policy, so I apologize. A report commissioned by the Federal Reserve Bank noted that 45% of the benefit of the three largest asset building policies, which are preferential treatment of capital gains, mortgage interest deductions, and property tax deductions, 45% of the benefit of those policies go to families whose average income exceed $1 million. By contrast, the lowest 60% of households received about 3% of the benefits in terms of the dollar value of the benefit received. The poorest fifth of Americans get on average $3 in benefits from these policies, while the wealthiest 1% enjoy on average $57,000. Households with incomes of $1 million or more receive an average benefit of $169,000. And just to represent that pictorially, this is, so these, what, well, we'll get into this in discussion maybe, so I won't waste time doing it here, but the basic idea is we incentivize and we subsidize asset accumulation through tax policy. And the expense of that policy, well, it's an expensive policy, but the benefits of that policy go to the wealthiest Americans by and large. Given this data, it's hard not to agree with Michael Seraden's conclusion that our public policies, quoting him for asset building, are making the comfortable more comfortable, the rich richer, and leaving the poor as they are. Okay, just a few words about inequality and Catholic social thought. And I want to mention very briefly and very selectively some important themes related to inequality in Catholic social teaching. The first, I just mentioned briefly, the preferential option for the poor. The preferential option for the poor has become increasingly important in modern Catholic social teaching. Despite the relative recent advocacy of this principle, one can trace the basic idea back to both the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. There we are told again and again that God has a special concern for the poor, downtrodden, marginalized, and oppressed. This concern is not portrayed as peripheral to the God of the Jews and Christians. Rather, God's concern for the poor is central to the biblical narrative. Thus, for example, central to the defining narrative of the Jewish faith, the Exodus, is the idea that God is moved by the cries of his people, a people who are portrayed as enslaved, impoverished, and socially and politically disempowered. Ultimately, the story of Exodus is a story of liberation, a liberation that includes freedom from material deprivation. They're led into the land of milk and honey. Concern for the poor is also central to the Christian story. In the Gospels, Jesus is portrayed repeatedly as one who has special concern for the poor and the marginalized in his society. His identification with the poor, perhaps best exemplified in the well-known biblical text, "Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me." One of the clearest and most eloquent expressions of the implications of the preferential option for the poor is found in the U.S. Catholic Bishop's pastoral letter on the economy. There we read that economic decisions, quote, must be judged in light of what they do for the poor, what they do to the poor, and what they enable the poor to do for themselves. The fundamental moral criterion for all economic decisions, policies, and institutions is this: they should be at the service of all people, but especially the poor. The point of these policies is not simply to provide material assistance to those who need it, although this is necessary to do. It is also to adopt policies and strategies that enable those at the margins of society to become full participating members of society. As the bishops put it, quoting them, "Basic justice calls for more than providing help to the poor and other members of society. It recognizes the priority of policies and programs that support family life and enhance participation through employment and the widespread ownership of property. For these reasons, ownership should be made possible for a broad sector for the population." There's a call for increasing the assets of those who are poor. A second theme in Catholic social teaching is something known as the universal destination of goods. In this Gaudium et Spes, which is a document produced by the Second Vatican Council, we read the following: "We are at a moment in history when the development of economic life could diminish social inequalities, yet all too often it serves only to intensify them, and even results in a decline in the social status of the weak and in contempt for the poor. To deal with this reality, the Council invoked an ancient teaching of the Christian Church, the universal destination of goods. The teaching itself is grounded in ancient scriptural texts, most importantly the Genesis creation story. The created world that we inhabit is not of our own making. It does not belong to us. We do not own it. It is a gift intended for the benefit of all." Pope Paul VI invokes the 4th century church father Ambrose, who says to the wealthy class, this is Ambrose speaking, "You are not making a gift of your possessions to the poor person. You are handing over to him what is his. For what has been given in common for the use of all, you have arrogated to yourself. The world is given to all, and not only to the rich." Later on, John Paul II spoke of a social mortgage on private property, quoting him, "It is necessary to state once more the characteristic principle of Christian social doctrine. The goods of this world are originally meant for all. The right to private property is valid and necessary, but it does not nullify the value of this principle. Private property, in fact, is under what he called a social mortgage, which means that it has an intrinsically social function based upon and justified precisely by the principle of the universal destination of goods." So the last thing I'll mention is the common good. The recognition of the social nature of the person finds expression in another important theme in Catholic social thought, that of the common good. In contrast to many forms of modern political liberalism that see an inherent tension or even incompatibility between the demands of the community and individual freedom, the Catholic tradition views the good of the individual and the good of community as integrally related. Thus, Pope John XXIII defines the common good as, quote, "the sum total of conditions of social living whereby persons are enabled more fully and readily to achieve their own perfection." In Catholic teaching, this perfection that human beings realize is not and cannot be achieved in isolation. Participation together in social life is integral, which is why practices and policies that push people to the margins not only cause harm to those people, the people that are pushed to the margins, they also cause harm to the people who are not at the margins, who are at the center of political life. We ought to worry about inequality not only for those who are obviously harmed by such inequalities, but also because we and the community as a whole are harmed when they are harmed. So I'll stop there because I'm over time, actually.